So, hey everyone, welcome back to a new episode of Gen Ed. And this episode, we have a very special guest, Natalie Gale, and we're going to be talking a little bit about one of her previous wave tides about counseling 101. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how to support those, like when they're stressed out, and like what we can do. So, Natalie, would you like to please introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Natalie Joy Gale. I am a current senior here at Harvard College. I am a joint concentrator, which is our version of a double major in history and literature and art, film, and visual studies. And I am planning to teach after graduation in May. So I'll be teaching English abroad.
That's awesome, Natalie. I also love history and literature, so I'm sure we'll get along great. um,
Definitely.
Unfortunately, compared to you, I am much less good with dealing with emotions. I am notoriously bad with dealing with my own and other people's emotions. It's kind of a well-known fact amongst my circle of friends. So I'm wondering if you can help me become a better friend, brother, etc., by helping me better support those around me. So I'm wondering right now, how can I, I'm in college right now. A lot of my friends and myself are stressed out a lot with tests and with projects. How can I better support other people when they get really stressed?
Well, that is a very big question. And I think I first of all want to say that it's really important to acknowledge that we all have really different kind of natural intuitive instincts and styles of like helping and supporting and being there for the people we love and the people in our lives. And I definitely like don't ever want to make it seem like there is one way, one correct way, one good way to do that, because we all have those different styles and we also all have really different needs. So depending on who you're talking with, they are probably looking for something different out of the conversation. But I can definitely give some kind of general insights, I hope, that come from my experience as like a mental health crisis counselor over the last 3 years. I think like the biggest thing and also the most like underemphasized thing, unfortunately, is the importance of just like presence, and just kind of being there at all. I think that like a lot of people worry a ton about what is like the right thing to say, the right way to react. When like a lot of the time, what means the most to someone is just like being present and like being willing to commit time and commit energy to making a space where they can share what they're feeling and just like be heard and feel like those things are valid and are worth kind of taking up space. So that's definitely like the biggest thing. And beyond that, there are a ton of different ways that we can make people feel even more kind of seen and heard. And yeah, just affirmed in whatever they might be experiencing or how they might be processing their experiences. Um, yeah, but I do think presence is something that gets really undersold a lot of the time when we talk about being there for other people.
Yeah, I definitely agree with how being present is probably like the most impactful thing and important thing for someone who's going through a rough time. Because often people feel alone, and just being there, even if it's listening to them rant or vent or like cry on your shoulder, it's better than being alone. And that's how we can really help one another. I'm very opposite of Dan. I am a very sensitive person. So I'm very good at emotions and telling when someone is feeling a little bit down. So You mentioned before that you were a mental health crisis. You helped out there. Could you tell me a little bit about like how you got involved? Like, because this is sort of like outside your major of like history and literature. So could you tell me a little bit about that and your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely not something that I ever like. It's kind of something that I stumbled into, I think. In high school and at the beginning of college, I was really, really involved in education. And specifically, I was really involved in education around like English for speakers of other languages. And a lot of the students that I spent a lot of time with and formed really close relationships had experienced like some really hard things. And so through that, I think that I had this kind of informal background of just like talking through really heavy stuff with people on a pretty regular basis. But I never thought of that as counseling. Like I might have labeled it something like trauma informed education or pedagogy. But when I got to college, I kind of continued down the education path, and then totally on a whim, I saw like an advertisement, an email pub, basically come across a listserv about this peer counseling group, which is a student-to-student mental health crisis support group. So the one that I kind of saw this advertisement for and became a part of kind of spontaneously is called Room 13. It is Harvard's largest peer counseling group. It's typically open in non-COVID times from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Every night of the academic year. We have a room in the basement of one of the first year residential halls, and anyone can come down to talk about anything that they're experiencing, and just have space for someone to kind of help move through those experiences with them. And currently we are doing Zoom counseling from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every night Eastern time for Harvard undergrads and grad students. So this group was something that I had heard a lot about my first year, and I don't think that I had ever really considered like joining it until I did see this pub for an info session for the interviews. And I was sort of like, oh, like I love having conversations with my friends, like when they are in tough situations. Like that's one of the moments where I feel like the most fulfilled and where I find a lot of meaning. So I guess I'll go and interview. And I did, and I was really lucky to get in and join that fall. And then I also ended up directing the service for the year of 2019, which was a really formative experience for me. But yeah, it definitely is a bit out of line with like what I study academically. But I think on a kind of big picture scale, the common thread through all of like these things that I do, whether it's like looking at art or whether it's counseling, is just like interest in making space where people can kind of process in a collective way and in a communal way whatever they may have experienced that's on their mind.
Yeah, I really love that you kind of, as you just mentioned, you this isn't what you study. You got into it because it was just kind of part of your life. You were supporting these students, and then you became more and more involved. It gives me some hope that eventually one day I can be a bit better at this. And yeah, I find it just really interesting that thing you brought up at the very end about making emotion communal, opening it up to everyone and kind of using each other as support. I'm wondering, I hadn't planned on talking about this until a little bit further down the line of this interview, but I was wondering, how do we like open up like that? How do we keep our emotions in in a safe atmosphere where we're able to support each other, because at times it feels like as a society we're somewhat emotionally closed off from each other, and we never want to be fully vulnerable. We never want to fully open up. So I'm wondering how do we both individually and as a society try to build a safer atmosphere where we can lean on each other for support?
Yeah, that's a really important question. That's a really hard question. I think that on interpersonal kind of levels, one thing that's really important when it comes to this is recognizing the kind of limitations and I guess, the opportunities of like vulnerability. So, thinking a lot here about boundaries, for example, thinking about kind of the way that opening up to the people that we love and that we feel safe with is like absolutely necessary to our well being on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. Just like feeling that we are valued comes so much from knowing that others are willing to kind of hear what we have to bring, what we have to offer, and the way that we experience the world, because we really do all experience everything in such different ways, and it's really impossible to know ever fully how someone else is experiencing the world. But kind of through sharing, I guess it feels like that is beginning to kind of cultivate that empathy and just move towards a fuller understanding, even though we can't ever know what it's like, because everyone experiences stuff all the time, like 24 hours a day. And if you're not doing that, you'll never have as deep of an understanding, I think. And so, like, being able to share the way that you experience the world, like your really singular way of existing, I think is such a major part of just like being a person. um, and feeling love and feeling relationships, and community. And I think a big part of that comes from a sense of safety and a sense of trust between people, that if you do share that really precious personal experience, that it'll be honored, it'll be valued and respected, and treated as valid, and not dismissed or demeaned or somehow looked down upon, because it is so singular and it might be different from how the person you're speaking with experiences the world. So I think that, like, making that trust and making it known that, like, you are seeking to understand rather than maybe to like impose your own experience of hearing about the situations that this person is going through, in my experience, is a really powerful thing. It One thing that we say a lot in the counseling service is that advice is a dime a dozen. Like, everyone frequently knows like what they think someone else should do, how they would react in a situation. But like being able to kind of look at the frameworks that someone else is applying to the situation, being able to hear really from their perspective what it's like to be them, and being able to see that and honor it, is just a really beautiful thing, I think.
Yeah, empathy and just thinking about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, um, not necessarily judging, but being vulnerable and to have that definite understanding. Um, I think with empathy, like too much can be a dangerous thing, but believe few of us have, or some of us need to work on empathy and putting each other in each other's shoes and seeing how their life is how their life is going and having that mutual understanding as you talked about before. um, that will definitely like gain that human connection and gain that trust just by understanding what everyone is going through. And I think going off of that, I love therapy. I myself go to therapy, and I feel a lot of other people should go to therapy. But it's not necessarily the idea of therapy, it's just having someone there to talk to, that presence, as you talked about before, and getting, like, not necessarily advice, but ways to cope with such like big emotions. And so I know you're not a therapist, but since you do have experience like with like mental health crisis like helpline, what are some tools to have in our toolbox to help ourselves during these difficult times or to help others?
For sure. I think that, oh, sorry, I am getting another call. Let me just decline that. There we go. Okay. Um, I think that this is also like a really individual thing. I think that there are kind of various various approaches to maybe finding space from whatever we're experiencing that might be stressful or heavy. So that can be kind of like distractions and like a form of compartmentalizing, you know? So finding ways to remind ourselves of the parts of our lives that aren't as stressful, that maybe like make us feel happy, feel joy, feel a little bit lighter rather than the parts that are just stressful. I think that there are also like so many ways that we can process on our own individually, like journaling, like making art, also just like talking with the people in our lives. These are all like different tools that might work differently for different people. Even like doing mindless tasks, like people sometimes talk about like adult coloring books or even doing like a crossword or a puzzle or something that can kind of, I don't know, somehow make space in your mind, for a little bit more, more lightness and more, yeah, just space, to think things through. I think there are so many tools like that. But also, it is like really important to know at what point, like, what you're carrying becomes too much for you to do without the help of someone who does have appropriate training, to kind of extend your capacity, your own capacity to process and to kind of heal yourself, from hard things in your life. Whether that is a therapist, whether that is a psychiatrist, if it's something that is becoming like a real obstacle like to your well-being on a regular basis. But that can also be a mentor or someone you trust, who has like training in these areas in terms of like supporting people in your particular situation. That can also be, like a worker at a crisis line, here in Boston. Like one of, the greatest resources is Samaritans, which is a 24-hour, hotline focused specifically on like particularly risky mental health situations, but they are open to talking about like any topic, and sometimes that space is needed. And I think that it's definitely a balance between those kind of individual tools and coping mechanisms that we develop on our own and that we can kind of share amongst ourselves as people like without very much training, like formal training on these topics. But then there also does come a point where it's important to recognize the limitations of those tools and when it's starting to feel like you might need help managing it, because we all do at some point, like whether that comes in professional help or in leaning on people in our own lives who have the bandwidth, to be there for us in the way that we need at any given moment.
So I'm wondering right now, you guys had talked about how it's not just about advice. You know, you said advice is a dime a dozen, and there's kind of a bit of a cliche, I guess, of sometimes it's not really a cliche. I guess it's more of a truth, but sometimes having to just sit there and just listen. You know, just listen to somebody talk about what's going on and just letting them kind of air it out and vent a little bit. And I'm wondering what makes an effective listener? How can I be a good listener to those in my life?
Hmm. I think that, like, again, I want to emphasize that everything I'm saying is like based on the specific style of the service that like I have worked for, and like I don't necessarily believe that there's like one way to be a good listener, because I do think we all have our own individual instincts and also our own individual needs when we're going into a conversation with somebody. But I think that there are a few kind of core values, at least, that guide our practice as peer counselors. So, one of the really big ones is empathy, which I've already touched on. Another one of the big ones is company, which I've also already touched on. Another that is really important is exploration. So, being able to help somebody who is feeling a lot of feelings but maybe hasn't quite fully articulated them to themselves or to someone else yet, helping them to be able to find kind of the words and find the meaning, or just articulate the meaning behind what they're experiencing emotionally. So for us, this comes in the form of maybe clarifying questions. If people say a particularly loaded term, like if someone comes in and says like, "Oh, like my head has been feeling really really fuzzy recently and it's been really weighing on me." Like diving into that, like not shying away from an ambiguous term, saying like, "Oh, like you said it sounds fuzzy. Like what does that mean for you? Like could you say more about that?" So really exploring like what they're experiencing, asking questions about like, "Oh, like what do you wish you felt like right now?" Or like hypotheticals, and different kind of exploratory tools can be really powerful in helping guide someone through what they're experiencing, or just being there with them as they kind of sort through it, rather than yeah, putting your own interpretation of the situation onto them when they're already kind of handling so much. So that's one other really core value for us. And then the last one of these kind of four that we bring up a lot is humility, and is kind of knowing your own limitations, knowing that advice might not be like, while it's always well intended, given that you will never really have like as full of an understanding of what someone's experiencing as they do, that's not necessarily something that you might be equipped to give, which of course again is very particular to our style, but does guide us a lot, both knowing that there are things that we can't do for other people, and kind of identifying the limits there. And another big part of that is also knowing when it's a little bit out of your depth, and like when it comes to a point of recognizing like, oh, this person has needs in terms of support that like I'm not the best person to help with, and balancing in that situation how to effectively communicate that you want to be sure they're getting whatever support is necessary for them, while also like taking stock of what options are available to them realistically, in terms of support, and yeah, just helping them to make the best decision for themselves there, while also keeping in mind your own well-being in that situation. So those are four kind of core values for us that guide a lot of the work that we do.
It's definitely a precious balance between um, being there for someone else and also taking care of your own needs. And I face some struggles with that where, like, their emotions and stuff would affect me, like, and it would, not necessarily drain me, but it would definitely I would put their emotions on top of mine, and it would, affect me. So, I guess, going off of that, um and there is a point in a time where sometimes we'd be like, "Hey, I can't, I gave all that I could, but I think this person still needs a little bit more help." How do we help them get the help they need, um, if they're willing and wanting that help? Do you have any advice to how we can support them with getting some more help?
Yeah, I think that that is something that is can feel really delicate to handle. I think this is something that makes a lot of people feel really daunted. It's really hard when someone is coming to you for help to feel like you are turning them away or passing them along. And it's important to do that, handle that in a way that's sensitive to like the trust that they've put in you by coming to you, you know? So definitely, it is a process, and I think that there are a few really important components to making a move in a conversation towards connecting them with other sources of support. I think kind of identifying, naming explicitly like parts of the conversation that make you feel like you might not be the best support system for them, whether that is an area of particular knowledge that you don't have. Maybe if you say someone is like really stressed about a class, but you feel like you're not super equipped to help them to find like ways to feel less stressed, like identifying like, oh, I'm not familiar with the course policies for this class, or I don't know the professor and I don't know how they would likely react to this, like that kind of thing. So identifying the parts of the conversation that have made you feel like you might just not be the best fit, expressing like really genuine care, expressing concern, voicing that you are making kind of the move that you're making because you want them to get the best support possible. So saying something along the lines of like, oh, like I want to make sure that like you are talking with someone who does have that information or who does have kind of the training or knowledge to help with these particular parts of the conversation. Those kind of just like naming that explicitly, I think is really important because it kind of affirms that you aren't like shoving them off somehow, that it is still out of care for them rather than lack of care, that you aren't sure that you are the best to be there for them. And then I think just being open to like realistically assessing who in their life, or what like new contacts can be made that might be able to provide that better help. So like in this example, maybe like reaching out to a course staff member, like a teaching assistant, a teaching fellow, a course assistant, could be really beneficial. Like just suggesting or thinking through like who would have the expertise needed to help you. Or that could be a professional. But again, it is hard to walk the line between knowing that like there are a ton of different barriers, financial, cultural, that can keep people from accessing different kinds of help. And so also not kind of putting pressure or putting shame on anyone to access any particular kind of help is important, and just to find kind of the best balance of of their needs with realities possible. And I think like also one kind of broader picture outside of this kind of conversational move of like what we might call in a counseling setting like referring someone to another resource, but what in like a day-to-day conversation can just look like brainstorming like future paths and like ways that they can continue to get support and process whatever they're feeling. But But like one broader picture thing that's really important is setting boundaries. And one element of that is actually consent, which I think we hear talked about a lot in terms of like sexual health and interpersonal relationships in that way. But just like it's a really good practice, I think, also in day to day life if you're experiencing something tricky, like just checking in before, like going into a conversation and being like, hey, like this kind of weird thing happened that's like throwing me off. Like, do you like have a minute to talk about it? Or like, would you like be able to talk about it today? Like, no worries, or if not, just so that you can be sure that like whoever is in that conversation with you is really able to give the kind of support that you're asking, rather than kind of reaching out and like launching into a conversation where you're seeking that kind of support, without first checking if that's something the person feels comfortable with. Yeah, just especially in interpersonal kind of non-explicitly counseling-y settings. That is something that I really strongly feel everyone should do much more than we currently do, because it really isn't something that we are taught about, and this stuff is hard.
I actually hadn't thought about that before, like being not only being a courteous friend as a listener, but also being courteous when you're looking for help. You know, not just trying to find someone who can actually help you, and trying to find someone who's comfortable helping you, instead of just like picking some, you know, your random friend who may not be equipped either with the emotional maturity or with the knowledge to be able to actually help you. I hadn't thought about that perspective, which is just really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, like to think about, because this stuff, it's really complicated and it's really important in all of our lives, and it's something that people don't talk about enough, in my opinion, my very biased opinion.
Yeah, and there's also the perspective, like, if they do go to you for help, like, that's a lot of courage it took for them to ask you, like,
Hmm.
for help. So you got both different perspectives to take into consideration when helping.
Hmm. Definitely, yeah. And like, yeah, that's why I think it's so good to make clear that like no matter what, your answer to a question like that of like, oh, do you have a minute to talk something through with me, like regardless of whether you do have that kind of emotional bandwidth at the moment, it's really important to always name that like you want to give them care in whatever way you are able, and still making clear like, oh, like right now, like I'm so sorry, but like I'm not in a really good place and I don't think I would be able to give you the kind of support that I'd want to. Like, could we check back in about it in a couple of days? Or like, is there anything I can do to help you like feel better that like would feel more natural? Like offering kind of different ways of providing care in a way that does feel right for you and feel feasible for you, depending on where you're at.
So, Alana, I know that you've talked about on some other episodes about getting therapy, I mean, going to therapy and getting help. And I know you've mentioned a helpline in the past. If anyone is looking for some of this support that we've been talking about, where can they go?
Yeah, so definitely check out if you are thinking about hurting yourself or others. There is a national suicide prevention helpline. The number is 1-800-273-TALK 8255. But if there are other options, I think you can chat and call with them. Also, check out your local college, school, university. You could also just Google, like, I need someone to talk to, and there are more local helplines to chat with, and maybe you'll end up talking to someone like Natalie. So who knows? Like, small world. Yeah. So, Dan, any final words?
I'm not sure if I have any final words. Natalie, do you have any final message that you think is vitally important to get out?
I mean, I think that one thing that I would want people to take away is just that everyone is experiencing the world in such unique and complicated ways. And so always remembering that, you know, everyone is as complicated as you are. um, and making a little more room in your life to hold all of those complexities and really be able to celebrate them and learn about them, I think is a really beautiful thing.
Thank you, Natalie. This has been super interesting. Hopefully, we're taking the first step to making myself not a robot. If if you guys listening right now are interested in this topic or others, make sure to go check out wavelearningfestival.org. It's a great website where you can investigate some of these topics for free and where you can get some tutoring services as well. So make sure to go check that out, and we'll see you guys next week.